Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here once again at the annual Stem Cells on the Mesa meeting and to have this opportunity to update you on the important and exciting progress that's being made as we advance our programs. I will be making some statements that are covered under Safe Harbor in this presentation. So, as we've described in previous presentations, Athersys is committed to delivering scalable and practical regenerative medicine therapies that are consistently safe and that deliver meaningful benefits to patients, particularly in areas of significant unmet medical need. Our vision for regenerative medicine utilizes a product called MultiStem that can be easily and conveniently stored in the hospital pharmacy, thawed within minutes, and quickly transferred into an IV bag or other delivery device, and then administered to the patient when the patient needs it in a very simple and streamlined and efficient manner. It's an approach that is highly scalable, is very efficient, and does not require highly specialized infrastructure at the point of care. Currently, we have multiple clinical stage programs that covering some key areas of unmet medical need in the neurological, cardiovascular, and inflammatory and immune areas, as well as in other programs that we're focused on. I won't be able to cover all of these in today's presentation in the interest of time, but I will focus on some key activities. In addition to ease of use, other key aspects of MultiStem include the scalability of the platform, which I referred to a moment ago, including the ability to produce millions of clinical doses with material obtained from a single healthy consenting donor. And a long shelf life, as I've mentioned before, we've already successfully completed 5-year stability studies on our cryopreserved product. And the consistent safety profile that we've now seen across multiple different clinical studies that we've run. We have extensive preclinical and clinical evidence that demonstrates that MultiStem can promote healing through multiple different important mechanisms. We predicted, and as I will show in just a few moments, have now confirmed that MultiStem has very powerful and potent immunomodulatory properties that are directly relevant to indications like ischemic stroke. The multimodal nature of this product is what distinguishes it from traditional therapeutic interventions, including pharmaceuticals or traditional biologics. One of the areas where we've done a lot of work is in the area of neurological injury and disease. Working with leading researchers and institutions internationally, outside independent labs, we've demonstrated that MultiStem is consistently safe and provides substantial therapeutic benefits in models of both acute and chronic neurological injury, neurological damage. Now, I'm not going to have time to cover all this work today, obviously, but I refer you to the publications on our website that provide greater detail and information related to this work. However, the one area that I do want to focus on today is our clinical program focused on treating ischemic stroke. Stroke is a devastating condition that affects nearly 16 million people annually. That's first-time ischemic stroke victims, and more than 2.2 million people in North America, the European Union, and Japan combined. Approximately a third of the patients that suffer a stroke die shortly after the ischemic event. And among the survivors, approximately 50% are left with substantial permanent disability that alters their quality of life irrevocably. Of the remaining patients that survive, many of them are left with moderate to minor disability, but that still has an impact on their quality of life. Among the patients that suffer more significant disability, many of these patients have to spend the rest of their days under full-time institutional care or require the constant support and attention of family members that are taking care of them at home. The economic and the quality of life impact of ischemic stroke is staggering. And it's unfortunate that the only currently available therapeutic interventions can only be administered within a very narrow time window. So this includes TPA, which has to be administered within 3 to 4.5 hours, or mechanical reperfusion, otherwise referred to as thrombectomy, which has to be done within 6 hours. The vast majority of patients don't get to the hospital in time to get either of these treatments. So it's only about 10% of patients that suffer an ischemic stroke actually get to the hospital so that they can be treated with either TPA or mechanical reperfusion or thrombectomy. Stroke represents a major public health issue in Japan. Data monitor epidemiological data indicates that there's over now 330,000 first-time ischemic stroke patients in Japan each year. Furthermore, as is widely recognized and as I described in a session this morning, Japan also has the most rapidly expanding elderly population of pretty much any country on the face of the planet. And over the past 18 months, we've been actively engaged with the PMDA, which is the FDA equivalent in Japan, and clinical experts in Japan, preparing for expansion of our clinical program to treat ischemic stroke. And we've received excellent feedback as well as meaningful enthusiasm and support. Japan represents a unique opportunity for two reasons. First, I'd argue that perhaps it has the most efficient reimbursement system in the world. We talked a little bit about that this morning at the workshop. Second, the leadership in Japan has taken bold and visionary steps to create a streamlined and efficient regulatory system in Japan that is specifically designed for regenerative medicine products like MultiStem. And I know several people have referred to this earlier today. Under this new system, which was first described only 2 years ago and is now being actively utilized, it's possible to run a highly efficient and focused clinical study or program that demonstrates consistent safety, and if it provides evidence of likely therapeutic benefit, then you can obtain either conditional or even full approval. Now, I think it's important to put this in context. This framework was only proposed a little over 2 years ago, and in the end of 2013, it was passed with overwhelming legislative support in Japan, and then only a year later, the regulations went into effect. And since that time, I would say recently, we've seen some very, very important steps forward that really confirm and validate this new regulatory approach. Just within the last few weeks, the first 2 regenerative medicine products were considered under this new regulatory framework. One received full approval and the other received conditional approval. This is a very, very important validation that says that not only is this a good idea, but it's actually being utilized in some very important ways. We've been intently focused on advancing some of our key programs in Japan, in particular our program that's focused on ischemic stroke. And that's really what I'm going to focus on today because that's the top priority for the company. Over the past several months, we've described the essential aspects of the clinical program that we've been running. It's an international double-blind placebo-controlled study focused on treating patients that have suffered a first-time ischemic stroke and that have suffered substantial and durable and meaningful disability as a result of that. The trial is designed to evaluate both safety and efficacy using standardized clinical rating scales that are commonly utilized around the world. The study was conducted at 33 sites, 27 in the United States and 6 in the UK. It was also a very well-balanced study, and I'm not going to summarize the demographic data, but it was actually very, very consistent, very well-balanced against both the placebo and the treatment groups. Now, as we've summarized previously in this and other studies, we've observed a very consistent and favorable safety profile when we administer MultiStem, with no evidence of any treatment-related adverse events. And in fact, I would argue that consistent safety has been a hallmark feature of MultiStem in the multiple clinical studies that we've already conducted. In fact, in this study, not only did we see consistent safety, but we actually saw lower mortality and lower infection rates and lower rates of life-threatening adverse events. And when you look at the entire intent-to-treat population, this data was actually pretty robust. It's worth noting that the secondary infections are actually a common complication in stroke victims. Many stroke victims or other acute neurological injury victims suffer from extended immunosuppression as a result of the stroke, and we have a very good understanding of why this happens. And we predicted and saw in this clinical study that we might be able to effectively address this. And in fact, we saw good, consistent evidence of that, and I'm going to show you some more examples in a minute. Now, when we look at the efficacy results, the first inspection of the results gave us kind of a mixed picture. We saw really promising and suggestive evidence of therapeutic benefit across multiple clinically relevant parameters. We didn't hit the endpoint for the study, and that was disappointing for everyone. However, because we saw such a very consistent pattern across these other clinical parameters, including the percentage of patients that achieved an excellent outcome, the percentage of patients that achieved global recovery, which means that they achieved good or excellent outcome in each of the 3 clinical rating scales that were being used to evaluate the patients, the percentage of patients that achieved an excellent neurological outcome, the length of hospitalization, the pattern of faster recovery. We were seeing consistent evidence across each one of these parameters that suggested to us that we were delivering meaningful therapeutic benefits. We also saw initial biomarker data that showed that as we predicted, we were seeing a significant impact on regulating immune system function in these patients, and we saw dramatically lower circulating inflammatory cells in these patients when we evaluated them. Now, when we looked further at the data, it didn't take very long for us to recognize and it's been a long-standing feature in the field of neurology, that time really matters when you're trying to treat patients. And what we saw very quickly was that if we were administering MultiStem within 36 hours, which is in stark contrast to the time limits represented by TPA or mechanical reperfusion, which is just 3 to 6 hours basically in that kind of a window. Provided we were treating MultiStem within 36 hours, we were seeing substantial, robust, and consistent improvement across the entire range of clinical parameters that we were looking at. So we were very, very encouraged by this, and we dug deeper into the data because we felt it was very important to develop an understanding of what was going on and where we were actually having a meaningful impact. One of the things we looked at was how are these patients actually faring over time? And as these graphs clearly show, there was very clear, consistent, and compelling evidence that patients that were being treated within 36 hours of their stroke were recovering faster and substantially more than the patients that were under normal standard of care. So again, a very consistent pattern that was statistically robust, that was giving us a very clear picture that MultiStem was providing a dramatic and substantial benefit in these patients. Another way that we evaluated patients was by trying to define what do we consider the optimal patient outcome. Well, in our mind, the optimal patient outcome is really represented here. It means the patient achieves good or excellent recovery in all 3 clinical rating scales, and they don't experience life-threatening adverse events, secondary infections that could extend their hospitalization or really complicate their recovery, or die. When we looked at the data through that lens, we saw a very clear picture. Patients that were getting treated early with MultiStem showed about a 4-time higher recovery rate. So 40% of the patients that were getting treated early with MultiStem versus only 11% of the placebo patients were showing dramatic recovery that met each of these criteria. I think that data kind of speaks for itself. So we and other people that have looked at this data closely are actually pretty excited about this, and they're also excited by some of the other evidence that we've seen that I'll just share with you as I'm closing here. We saw dramatically shorter hospitalization. We saw significantly reduced time in intensive care for these patients. So all of these indicators are pointing in the same direction, which is we're making a difference. We're helping these patients recover. But I think another compelling piece of evidence is the biomarker data that we've now gathered over the past several months confirms mechanistically what we suspected was going to be happening in these patients. In fact, when we treat patients and we look at the intent to treat population, meaning all patients that were treated in the study, we see a very clear pattern that we're reducing the inflammatory cascade, that hyperinflammatory cascade that actually does a lot of the damage following a stroke and actually creates much of the permanent brain damage that occurs in these patients. And we see it across a range of very important inflammatory cytokines. Furthermore, as shown in the green line here, when we look at patients that actually received treatment with MultiStem within 36 hours, the picture becomes even more compelling and is highly statistically significant. So again, a very clear and consistent pattern. And when you drill down to some of the specific cytokines that we were looking at, again, I think these numbers speak for themselves. We were seeing dramatic reduction in the inflammatory cascade that was hitting on multiple key points that was showing that this therapy is working and we can explain how it works. So just to summarize, we see from this study that MultiStem is consistently safe. That's a very important feature of this product. We've heard from many neurologists around the world that have said this is a very clean safety profile. I wouldn't hesitate to give it to patients that have had a stroke that are under my care. Similar to some of the early studies related to TPA and some of the other interventions, we see that time really matters. If we give this therapy within a 36-hour window, which, by the way, is a window that 90 to 95% of stroke patients actually arrive at the hospital within 36 hours or less, which means we can touch the vast majority of them with a therapy like MultiStem. We also see that the biomarker analysis provides direct supporting evidence mechanistically of the effects of MultiStem, and future studies are going to further explore this along with some of the other relevant parameters. So just in closing, and it's my last slide, we're actively planning for the next phase of clinical development in the U.S., North America, European Union, and Japan. We intend to initiate these studies in 2016. We're also continuing to progress our ongoing phase 2 study evaluating MultiStem in acute myocardial infarction, and we're preparing to launch our exploratory study evaluating the administration of MultiStem to patients that are suffering from acute respiratory distress syndrome. We remain actively engaged in partnering discussions, and I know people are looking for an update related to our partnership with Chugai. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to give you an update on that today, but we do expect to provide an update very, very soon. So we're very excited about the progress we're making in multiple different areas, and we're excited about the future and the next phase of clinical development related to our stroke program and the other key programs that we're advancing. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and attention.